Hello, this is a video about editing raw files in Adobe Photoshop Elements, which I shall call Elements, and Adobe Camera Raw, which I shall call ACR. We're looking at the moment at Elements, and I'm using version 14 of Elements. And I've got some images here that we're going to look at. I'm going to put these to one side and just drag them into Elements when I want to use them. So I'll drag one in now, and let's just look very briefly at the overall process. The first thing is you put a raw file into Elements. We're now in Adobe Camera Raw, ACR, and this allows us to do various things with it. We'll come back in a moment to look at that, but for now I'll just do one thing to it. And let's suppose I finished at all I want to do in ACR with this image. Down here I have Open Image, and that takes me to Elements with the image loaded. And that's the basic process that you use. It's pretty straightforward. Let's go back now and look at that in a little more detail, looking at the interface of these two products. So I started by dragging a file in. Obviously I could use the file system to go and find it. Oh, and it's remembered what I did last time round, which is why this has come up. It started looking like this. Now, there's a question of whether ACR will be able to read the raw files that you give to it. And the answer is sometimes. It depends upon how modern your camera is in relation to how modern your version of Elements is, as far as I understand it. You may find that with newer cameras, Elements says it can't read them. If that happens, you can use something called Adobe DNG converter, which converts raw files into what Adobe calls digital negatives, which Elements can read. And these DNG files have all the information that a raw file has in them. Adobe DNG converter is free, and they keep it up to date for new cameras. So you can carry on using whatever version of Elements you want and still be able to edit raw files, as long as you go through the extra step of converting them into DNG files. And you can do a whole directory, a whole folder at once, so you can do hundreds of files conversion in one step. So once you've got your raw file into ACR, you have two sets of sliders that you can use. We're looking at one of them here, and this is very similar, if not identical, to the latest versions of Lightroom, or the basic section of Lightroom. I think it's true for version 5 and version 6 of Lightroom. What we have at the top is white balance adjustment, where you have the normal presets for daylight, cloudy and so on. You've got a temperature and tint slider. Then you've got exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. Whites and blacks being the very brightest and the very darkest areas. And you've got clarity, vibrance and saturation. On the other tab we have sharpening at the top and noise reduction at the bottom. There is a third tab to do with camera calibration, but I'm not going to talk about that. If we go back to the one with sharpening and noise reduction on it, which is the same as the detail section in Lightroom, we can see that ACR has applied some sharpening to the image. It does this by default. I'd be inclined to leave that like it is, although I might turn the masking up halfway or so. With noise reduction, ACR doesn't apply any luminance noise reduction by default, so if you've got a higher ISO image, you might want to add some luminance noise reduction at this point. ACR, like Lightroom, does apply color noise reduction, and that I find is usually enough to deal with the color or chroma noise in my images, some of which are quite noisy. Up on the top left here we've got a small number of icons. One of them is white balance, so I've got an eyedropper, and if I go to somewhere that I want white in the image, I won't actually do that yet, come to think of it. Before I do that, so that we can see what's happening, I'll tell ACR that I want it to do an auto tone adjust, and that's done quite a good job. Some of you will have seen earlier videos in which I've dealt with this image, and that's a fairly good result with one click, I think, compared to what I had to do with some other products in order to make this image usable. So now I can change the white balance by using the eyedropper on somewhere white, and that just did it. I don't know what the noise was. Don't know if you picked that up. You can crop if you want to here. I wouldn't use this for cropping, but you can. And you can also make it horizontal or vertical. You can put a line down, for example, on that lamppost, and that then makes it vertical. So the other thing, we've been through all the sliders here, so once you've finished with all you can do in ACR, and ACR only does, as you can see, global adjustments. If we want any local adjustments, they're going to have to be done in Elements. So once you've finished with ACR, down here there's an Open Image button, and if I press that, we'll be taken into Elements with our straightened image, with its white balance adjusted and the shadows pulled up and so on. That may be perfectly usable now, but let's look at some of the things that we might want to do with this in Elements. Some local adjustments, for example. It might be that I think, well, it's a bit dark here on this hedge, I'd like that a bit brighter. It was a bright day and they don't look very bright to me. In fact, these hedges generally don't look very bright. Now what we've got in Elements is some tools over here on the left. The menus at the top, which are more important, I find, than the menus in the other products I've been using, because you have to use these in order to get at some of the functionality, certainly that I want to use. Down at the bottom we can see the parameters that are being used for the tool that is currently selected. Just looking at a few of these tools, we've got Dodge, for example, Blur, Clone Stamp, Brush, Red Eye Removal and Spot Healing. Some of these do more than one thing. If I go to Dodge, I see down here there are three things. There's Dodge, there's something called the Sponge, and Burn. Similarly, where it says Blur, I've got Blur down here, and Sharpen and Smudge. What you can do with these is local adjustments. So for example, suppose I want to make these hedges brighter. That is a Dodge operation. So I go to Dodge. I've now got, it's I don't think you'll be able to see this on the video, but instead of the cursor that I'm expecting, a nice round thing that I can paint with, I've got a no entry sign. The reason for that is that when you transfer the image from ACR to Elements, the image is in a 16-bit format, and there are things you can do in Elements with it still in 16-bit format, and the longer you can keep it in that format, the better it is. However, you often get to the point where you have to drop it down to 8 bits because fundamentally Elements is an 8-bit piece of software. So I'm going to go up to Image, Mode, 8 bits per channel. Now this is an example with Elements that Elements does have some easy modes. It's got this quick mode which gives you some basic things like Smart Fix and Exposure. If we look at Exposure, for example, it drops down some options that you can use, and you can point at them and it will change it accordingly. Very small range of things that you can do with this quick mode. There's a guided mode which is more task oriented, and it's got some tabs at the top for 5 or 6 different sorts of things you might want to do, and under each of these tabs there's a number of things that you might want to do, like adjusting brightness and contrast, using the levels tool, lightening and darkening things, resizing and so on. I find that for the sort of things that I want to do, neither the quick nor the guided approach really gives me the range of functions that I need. And so if I was using Lightroom, Elements, as my normal editing tool, then I would be using it in expert mode. I have to say I'm normally a user of Lightroom and DxO Optics Pro and possibly Silky Pix for flowers. So we've got these 3 modes, and I'm in expert mode, and I want to make these hedges brighter, so I have to put the image into 8-bit per channel mode. And as I say, this is an example of you have to know where things are. You have to find out a certain level of how this thing works in order to be able to use it. So it's part way on the way to Photoshop in that sense, and in fact a lot of the things in the menus are quite similar, certainly to the old version of Photoshop that I've got. I don't know how it relates to newer versions of Photoshop. So I'll go into mode and I'll change it into 8 bits. Now I've got the tool that I wanted, and I'm going to dodge. I can choose the size of the brush, and I can also, if I press the right buttons, I can do that with the mouse. And I can choose how much I'm going to increase the exposure by, and I'll try not to do it too much to make it too garish. So if I paint on here, we can see now that that's getting brighter. It's also looking a rather horrible featureless green. It seems to have a white patina over it, which is rather unpleasant. What I might want to do is to increase the saturation here, and that's where this sponge comes into it, because the sponge lets you saturate and desaturate areas. So I'll choose saturate, and I'll make the paintbrush bigger, and now it's saturating those areas, which also doesn't look right because the saturation is different from the other things. But there are occasions when that looks absolutely horrible, when you might want to alter the saturation locally and the brightness, and for that matter sharpening. We'll see an example of sharpening, local sharpening, later. Let's go on to the next example. One of the issues with these raw images, as we've discovered with other things, I say this is in a long series of threads that's going on at dpreview.com. one of the things we discovered is that some of these raw editors are better than others at dealing with geometric distortion, especially when you take pictures at wide angle. Now this is a wide angle picture, and what I'm going to do, this is looking now in DxO Optics Pro 10, and we're looking at a JPEG. So this is the way it comes out of the camera. And this is what it looks like if you load the raw file into DxO. It's curved here, and it's curved there, and it's also slightly curved that way. It's got barrel distortion. The JPEG didn't have that. The JPEG had been corrected well. The DxO version isn't as corrected as well. If we now look at Helican filter, that's what the raw looks like, and the correction is worse than in DxO. So with both DxO and Helican filter, you have to make adjustments to deal with this barrel distortion if you've got shots, wide angle shots. Let's now look at elements. Now this is the way it's come into ACR. It looks exactly like the JPEG. It's the same as with Lightroom and presumably Photoshop. The correction is done automatically. Then carrying on with the subject of, and I don't want to do anything to this image, so I'll just throw that one away. Dealing with geometric distortion, this image, this one's actually JPEG. I don't know if you noticed that when I dragged it in, ACR didn't come up, we went straight into elements. That's because this is a JPEG image. And this image has vertical and horizontal geometric distortion. We're looking at it from the side and below. In addition to that, it's got barrel distortion when viewed in some products. I don't think it's got noticeable barrel distortion here, although it's very difficult to tell sometimes when there are these other sorts of geometric distortion there at the same time. So I might want to try and correct this distortion, and under filter here I've got correct camera distortion. Again, easy to find if you know where it is. I've now got some sliders I can use. The top one would be for barrel distortion or pincushion distortion, but I don't think we need to use that. We're looking at this from below, so there's vertical distortion, and it looks to me as if in fact the image is on a slant as well. It's slanting bottom right to top left, so it needs to be rotated a little. That will then be easier to see what we need to do by way of the vertical perspective, and you can play with these for ages, but I'm sure you get the idea. And you can try horizontal perspective as well when you get to look at it as if you were more from the front, viewing from the front rather than the side. However, if you don't have lots of space around your image, both vertical and horizontal corrections can leave you with less of the image than you wanted and too little for it actually to be interesting. So that's dealing with geometric distortions. Incidentally, you can also arrange it so that you can see how Lightroom Elements is what it's doing by way of bending and shaping the image, and you can crop it wherever you want within that area. So if we put this one away now, the next one, we're back to raw images now, is a sunset. Now I can try, for example, I'd like to see what's going on in those clouds, so I can raise the shadows. It doesn't do a whole heap. What I can try doing instead is, well, let's try it with auto and see what it does. Oh, that's looking a bit better. I can see more in the sky now. And I might want to raise the shadows some more so I can see more. And perhaps I'd want to pull the highlights down a bit as well. And that's possibly nicer, possibly not, depending on how you like these things. That's how it was. That's how it is now. If we now put this into elements, one of the things that some people will like about elements is the fact that it's got layers. Now, you can do absolutely wonderful things with layers if you know what you're doing. I don't. I've never really come to grips with layers. I've never really felt the need to. So I'm going to use a rather simple example, but I do believe they can be used for really quite clever and complicated things. What I'm going to do is to put down a layer called, now I can't. The reason being that I'm in 16-bit mode and I can't use layers unless I go into 8-bit mode. So once again, I have to make it 8-bit. Now I can have a new adjustment layer, and I'm going to make one that deals with brightness and contrast. Now if I have a look, if I can work out how to do it, at the layers, here we've got the image, and on top of it we've got what you might think of as a sheet of glass. We're just looking straight through it. It's not doing anything at the moment. However, it's a magical piece of glass, and it can affect the image that we're looking at. And in this case, if I take that away, in this case it can alter the brightness and the contrast. Fair enough. Well, why would you want to do that? You can do that anyway. Well, we've now got our magical piece of glass, which is making the whole image brighter. It's got this thing here called a layer mask, and I can paint on that. At the moment, this is a transparent piece of glass, and I'm going to paint on it with black so it gets blocked in some places. So I'm going to use a paintbrush, and I'm going to paint. What I'll do is I'll set it so it's painting halfway between black and white, and I'm going to paint across here, and where I'm painting is getting darker because the effect of, it's like I've painted some grey stuff on this piece of glass, and where I've painted on it the effect is lessened in this case. And we can see here up on the, I don't know if you see it on the video, but there's a grey line across the layer mask there. Next thing I'm going to do is I'll turn the brush right up so it's painting absolute black, and I'll make it bigger, and I'll paint across here. So it's gone really dark. So I've got a nice contrast now between the sea and the clouds. But I'd really like this light here to be a bit brighter on the sea. So I've now laid down on my mask, I've laid down a black line, thick black layer across here. I'm going to change the colour of the brush to white. I'll make the brush smaller, and then I'll just brush down here and that bit will get brighter. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like these clouds to be more saturated. I like bright colours. I do for sunsets anyway. So what I'm going to do now is to put another layer down, another adjustment layer, and this one will deal with hue and saturation. And what I'll do is turn up the saturation. Well, the pinks have gone, how I wouldn't mind them being. The rest I'm not so sure about, so I can do things like paint with black and stop it having any effect down here on the saturation. Perhaps I'd also like to leave the saturation alone in that area as well. It's just the clouds I really want. The other thing is that although I quite like the pink, the blue looks a bit too strong for my liking. So I'll change this so I'm just affecting the blues, and I'll turn the saturation down of the blues. Now perhaps you're beginning to see why some people think layers are a nice idea. As I say, they're something I've never got into, but even I'm beginning to see that perhaps they have some potential. Next example. Here we have an image which is hazy, and I can auto adjust it here, and it's got brighter, and that's all I'm going to do for now. I'm going to open it in Elements. Now version 14 of Elements has a haze, or an enhanced haze remover, and so I'm going to go to Haze Removal. Again, I need to know where to find it in the menus. And I've now got a couple of sliders I can play with, which will increase or decrease the effect. I can't really work out what the difference is between these two sliders, but there again, I've only had this product for about 4 hours so far. And you can look at the before and after to see what the effect is. That might be useful. Next example. Oh, and it does take a bit of time to actually do the haze removal. That's why I couldn't get the get elements to react for a few seconds. So I'll close that one. The next example is a very simple one. I want to, this is a very black bird, and I want to be able to see a bit more of it, and I want to turn the highlights up, and I might want to do what I do in Lightroom often is if I turn the highlights up, it's sometimes nice to turn the blacks down a bit to stop it looking too flat. And with that particular image, that might be all we want to do. Now I can't actually save this as a JPEG from ACR. I can only save things as DNG files. So if I wanted to use this, and this is all I wanted to do with it, I'd have to open the image in Elements and then use File Save in the normal way. The next example, and by the way, a lot of these examples I have used in other videos, so it is possible to do a bit of comparison. This statue, this image was overexposed by accident, and this statue is irrecoverable in JPEG, but it is recoverable in RAW. And I'm going to ask ACR to do its auto trick on it, and to my surprise, it hasn't done what I thought it was going to do, which is interesting. I'll pull the highlights down. Yes, and if we have a closer look at this, I think we'll find that, yes, we can see what's going on there. I'd say with the JPEG version, this is just completely white. So that's, I think, done that quite nicely. What I'll do now is to go into Elements with it, and what I'm going to try now, try possibly being the operative word, is to turn this sky blue. So I'm going to try selecting it. There's a quick selection tool, and I'm going to click inside this area here. Oh, and probably I can't do it because, is that because I'm in 16-bit mode? I'm in 8-bit mode now, and I click in there, and it's not doing much for reasons I'm not understanding yet. And after a short pause, I've discovered that I was using the wrong tool. I was using the quick selection tool, which is what I thought I'd ought to use for a selection, but it turns out I should have used the magic wand. So if I just go back to where I started, that's what it was like when I came into here, and I can't do anything because I'm back into 16-bit mode again. So I'll put it into 8-bit mode, and now I'll use the magic wand and click in this area here. Now there's loads of other areas like this that I want to select, and they are really fiddly in here, and there's an easier bit over here. What I'm going to do is to say select similar. Now what it's done is it's picked this area out over here, it's picked these fiddly bits in here, but it's also picked some bits that I don't want it to pick, and I can alter that to some extent by altering this tolerance slider. But basically I still got this stuff at the bottom that I don't want selected. So I'll use the lasso, and if I press the right button, there's a little minus sign on the cursor now, and these bright areas here I don't think are sky, I think they're highlights on these bushes, and there's some up here, and I don't think that's sky either, so I'm going to come round. The statue I don't want. So that takes all of those things out of the selection, and what I'm left with now is the sky, or those areas of the sky. And I'm now going to paint a colour onto those. I'll use the paint bucket, and the colour I'm going to paint with is the foreground colour here. So if I choose a blue colour, and probably needs to be a light blue, let's try that. And if I then paint in here and say that the pixels that it fills don't have to be contiguous with one another, touching one another, whoops, press the right button, and now it's turned all those areas blue. So if I looked carefully, I would find out whether that was actually accurate enough or not. But that is quite a difficult operation actually, I think. So that's that example. Next we have the first of two images. Oops, did I say save by accident? I think I probably did. We have the first of two images from Mike Digi at dpreview.com. This is one that I've used before. The problem here is what to do about these windows. If you look closely at them, they're a bit difficult to see what's going on here. They're slightly overexposed, and there are some windows over on the right which are definitely overexposed. They're irrecoverably overexposed even in RAW. Or they can be improved a little bit. We can see from the histogram here that there's something nasty going on at the top end. I can try auto with this, and it didn't seem to make much difference as far as I can see. No. So what I'll do is pull the highlights down, and that, let's just take it back, that might actually be sufficient to do the job. If we have a look at that window, we can now see more. If I turn that, that's how it was, that's how it is now. The problem, we can turn this down further. The problem is the more you do that, the more the walls become darker. You may not be able to see this on the video, but in fact there's a lot of noise in the walls here. Two reasons for that. One is this image is an ISO 800 image from a small sensor camera. They're noisy anyway, and as soon as you start mucking about with highlights and shadows, you're very likely to introduce extra noise into the image. So one of the things we might want to do with this is to go to the other tab where it's got the noise reduction, and if we go back and have a closer look at that wall, we might want to apply some luminance noise reduction. There's no chroma noise that I can see. Now the noise has probably gone away sufficiently. You don't necessarily want to get rid of it all, but you want to get rid of enough of it so it doesn't notice when you're looking at the image at the target size. And there might be some, I don't know if that's cobwebs up there or noise, quite possibly noise where it's getting darker. So I could turn the noise reduction up a bit. Now the sharpness will have suffered, and I might want to increase the sharpness in order to compensate for the loss of sharpness from the noise reduction. And here we have the masking, which I mentioned earlier, and this allows you to define which areas the sharpening applies to. The black areas now won't receive any sharpening, which means that you're not sharpening noise in the plane areas that are particularly prone to noise. Now we could go into, and these windows as well have also have been improved a little, although they are irrecoverable. That may well be enough. You could take it into Elements and do other things with it, but you might not need to do any more than that. Here's another example to do with nasty highlights, and again these clouds are irrecoverable in JPEG. They look absolutely horrible, and here I can, let's get it to do an auto on it, and again it's not done terribly well, so let's put it back as it was and bring the highlights down. Again, that's not too bad. Now you can imagine we could go into Elements and start mucking about with the colours here, or make that dark area a bit lighter. The trouble is it goes to a nasty grey and looks stupid if you do too much to it. We might turn the saturation up here. There's lots of things we could do with it. But basically in ACR now we've got this to the point where it's usable. The point about doing things like bringing highlights down and bringing shadows up in ACR is that we're using the maximum amount of information that's available in the raw file, and that is particularly useful for three things that I know of, and I expect for other things as well. Bringing up shadows, bringing down highlights, and in both cases you're trying to draw in the information that would normally be outside the range of what you could see. It's what's called the headroom in the file. I don't know what the opposite of headroom is at the other end, but the sort of information that gets thrown away in JPEGs. The other thing that's very good for, the third thing, is for setting the white balance, because when you're dealing with a raw file you can use something like daylight or cloudy, or you can use a particular temperature, a numeric value of the temperature and the tint that you might happen to know is suitable for a particular occasion. Once you transfer the file into another format like TIFF or JPEG, you can no longer do that, and you get a rather cruder method of, you get both these sliders, but what you can do with them is much cruder, and you don't have these absolute values of daylight and cloudy and particular temperatures and tints. It's all relative to what it is already. You know, turn it up 3, turn it down 5, or whatever. So the general idea is to do as much as you can inside ACR while you're still working with the raw file, and then give it to Elements or some other application to do any finishing off, any local processing, local adjustments, and so on. So let's throw that one away. Next we have, in the previous one we had a radical overexposure. Here we've got a radical underexposure. We can see from the histogram that it's hugely underexposed. I just said to do auto on that, and now we're in the situation where we could take this into Elements and use it. Incidentally, this vignetting you can see is nothing to do with ACR not correcting anything. This was taken with a close-up lens at too wide an angle, and what we're seeing is the inside of a tube that the close-up lens sits on. So there's nothing ACR could do about that, but you could crop it in here if you wanted to before taking it across into Elements. The next example is a sunset, and in this case I want to see the side of this boat, so I want the shadows to come up, and that yellow is a false colour. It often turns up in photos, and I find when I actually look at the sky, look up from the camera, I'm not seeing yellow. I'd like to moderate that a bit, and if I pull the highlights down, it's actually still yellow, but at least there's a sort of a consistency, I suppose, between that middle area and the areas to the side of it. Very much a matter of taste. Here's an example where we might actually want to use the leveling, although we can do that in Elements as well. And the way it works is, as it is in Elements, that you find something that you believe ought to be level, you put a line down and it adjusts it. Now oddly enough, it looks as if it hasn't done anything. I think it probably has. I do find it very difficult with these boats to actually, because of the way the coast works opposite, to find out when things are level. I get a lot of optical illusions, again like with this line here, which isn't parallel with the bottom of the image, which may be making the boat look as though it's on a bit of a slant. Now this is the case where we've pulled up the highlights of the shadows a lot, and if we have a close look, we'll find that there is a horrible amount of noise. And this is a case where, while you're still dealing with the raw data, you might well want to give it a good go with luminance noise reduction. Again, the idea is not necessarily to get rid of it completely, but you want to get rid of a lot of it because it is particularly nasty here. Again, we could do some local adjustments if we took it into Elements. The next example is a JPEG. So when I drag this in, ACR isn't going to appear, and we're straight into Elements. What I'm going to do here, or try to do here, is fairly straightforward on the face of it. I want to get rid of this piece of rope dangling from the back of the wagon. To do this, I'm going to go and look for something there, spot healing brush tool. I'll try that. And if I can, of course I'm in 16-bit mode, and I probably can't do this in 16-bit mode. So no, I'm in a JPEG, of course. That's not the problem. Don't know quite why I can't change the size of this. That's maybe because I'm pressing the wrong button. If I press the right button, I'd probably get the right result. So I'm using this, what's it called? spot healing brush, and I'm going to go like that, and well, the piece of rope has disappeared, but if we have a close look, it's not actually done a terribly good job. It's not really very realistic. So what I'll do is go back to where I was, and I'll use a different tool. I'll use the clone stamp this time, and I'll make it bigger. And what I do here is usual thing. I tell it where I want to pick up from, then I move to where I want to put it, and I start clicking away. And because of where I'm picking up from in relation to where I'm placing down, it's going to be much more consistent in terms of what it's doing. Now, to finish that off properly, I zoom in closer so I could get a nice straight line across there. But this time, if we do go and have a closer look at this, I think we'll find it's better than it was previously. The next example is one that several of us at dpreview.com have had a go at. What I suggested was, now this is a picture that was taken in bright sunlight, and I said to people, well, can you make it look as if it's in bright sunlight? Because that's not what I see when I'm looking at that flower. Everything, apart from this, there's a shadow area here, everything looked bright. It was a screw your eyes up type bright day. And I want this grass, for example, to look quite bright. What I'll try doing, let's try it with auto first, and that's better. But it's not, I don't think this is looking bright. And I've played with various sliders here, and I think what we may find is if I use the clarity slider, it's making that, there's a side effect really of clarity. Turns out that it does make the grass look quite bright. Now, I know a lot of people actually don't like this effect. We had some discussion about what this should look like, and this is most certainly not to everybody's taste. But it is a bit more like what I saw. It's still actually not bright enough, that grass, for my recollection of what I saw. I might also want to bring the highlights down a bit. Oh, actually, I don't think I would. I might turn them up and risk a bit of blown areas, because again, that did look definitely quite bright, the flower. What I might want to do is to change it. At the moment, this is looking quite cold, and I might want to shift the white balance slightly towards the yellow. Whether that would be perceptible on the video, I have no idea. And at that point, this is another one where, from my point of view, that might actually be pretty much all I needed to do, although I still would have to put it into elements in order to be able to make a JPEG that I could share with other people. But with some images, it does look like ACR can do what's needed. The next example is one where we're back to a raw file here. It's actually a DNG file, this one. This has something going on which I call bleaching. The sun can, without actually blowing an area, we can see at the top end of the histogram, there's no evidence that that this photo has particularly blown areas in it, but it's quite possible for areas to lose colour, before they get blown, and I think this is going on here. And I've discovered that Silky Pix, for example, is really rather good at dealing with this. What I'm going to do is to, if I make that slightly less magnified, I'm interested in this area here and this area, and I want to see what happens when I pull the highlights down, which I have done. It started like this, and so you pull them down. The top area looks okay, but this one, I don't know. I'd need to do a close comparison with Silky Pix. I think that in Silky Pix I can get that, it can pull back some of the blue that was in there. And I think that's one of Silky Pix's strong points, and this is one area I think probably where Elements isn't as good as Silky Pix. But I'm not 100% certain of that, to be honest. But I think so. Next, we've got an example that's been used at dpreview.com. It's a difficult photo, this one. And people, including me, have tried all sorts of things with it. And what I'm going to do this time is different from what I've done before. I'm simply going to leave this like it is. What I might do first is apply a bit of noise reduction to it. It's an ISO 400 image from a small sensor camera, so it is a bit noisy if we have a look at it at 100%. I'm just going to apply some luminance noise reduction, because what I'm going to do to it subsequently will tend to bring out the noise. So I've reduced the noise, and that of course reduces the definition of the thing as well. There's always a trade-off between noise reduction and detail. In fact, though, this image doesn't have much detail in it. It's much more about contrast than about... there isn't any fine detail in it, I don't think. So that's all I've done, applied a bit of noise reduction, and I'm now going to go into Elements. And I'm going to try doing one thing with it. Let's put that away. I'm going to use something that's new in version 14 of Elements, which is haze removal. Now, this is something we saw earlier with the boat, and that's what it's meant to be used for. However, it struck me that looking at this, it looked hazy to me. So I thought, well, let's try using it. And I've got a feeling the result that I've got with this, that there are maybe some other things that I'd want to do with it, but I mean, there's the before and after. This is pretty much as good as I've got with anything else that I've tried with it, I think. Now, it takes time. I've gone back into Elements, and it does take time to apply the filter. But yeah, I have a feeling that that may be okay. I'm getting... I've been reading about this online. I'm getting indications here of overexposure. If we look at the histogram, there's not much sign of it there. And I don't really know what's going on, but if I move in closer, it goes away. And apparently I saw something from one of the Adobe staff members saying that this is... well, essentially saying that this is a feature, not a bug, depending on what size you're rendering this as. Anyway, that may or may not be blown. It doesn't look like it from the histogram. Two more examples to go. Close this one down. Here's another one which has caused me some problems. This image has a couple of problems. One is its high dynamic range. This is very dark here. And it's also suffering from two sorts of distortion. It's got barrel distortion because it's a wide angle image, and it's got vertical geometric distortion. This house is leaning in, and you probably can't see it on the video, but there's a bridge over here with two stanchions which are actually pointing up and to the right. So we've got this effect of a triangle with things leaning inwards. So I want to get rid of that. Now, this is proved to be quite difficult to deal with in applications that didn't handle the geometric distortion, the barrel distortion caused by using wide angle, that didn't deal with that very well. We've seen that ACR deals with it better, a lot better. So what we'll be trying to do is to cure the remaining distortion, which is vertical geometric distortion. vertical perspective distortion. What I do want to do though while I'm still in ACR is raise the shadows, and again I've got a rather flat HDR-y type look there, and I might well draw the blacks down a bit to give it a bit more contrast, and that's probably about as much as I'd want to do in ACR. And now I need to try and deal with the geometric distortion. So I look at the camera distortion, I go to the vertical one and I try curing it. And I think there may still be a bit of barrel distortion here. I'm not sure. I think the house may be upright now. I don't know why I'm not seeing a grid. I don't know if there's an option. Oh, show grid. Here we are. I think the house is okay. Oh, and yeah, the bridge is very nearly okay. I think there may be a little bit of residual barrel distortion, which may need to be dealt with, which that may or may not be doing. And now the house is skewy. You have to keep working with rotation and these distortions interact with one another, and that's not right. But I'm fairly confident that if I spent the time on it, I could actually get that right. Another problem that I thought was a problem with Silky Pix was that it was cropping it and wouldn't let me get to the bit of the picture that I wanted to actually use. That was operator error on my part. There is an equivalent in Silky Pix of what I'm about to do here, which lets you see all of the image in its distorted form and lets you crop wherever you want from it. So that's geometric distortion again in Elements. Last example is to do with sharpening. This is overexposed. If we look at the histogram, it's pretty heavy at the top end, and in fact there's a marker indicating that there's overexposure. What I'll do is bring the highlights down, and that's not brilliant because there's veining here, which I've seen more clearly with other products. What I can try doing is bringing the exposure, there they are, bring the exposure down, and that's much better. What I might do now is, the background looks a bit dark and this fly looks a bit sharp, so I might well bring the shadows up, and that's made the fly look better to my eye as well as the background. And now I can take it into Elements, and what I want to do is not strictly necessary in this case, I think, but you do get the situation where you've got a subject and you've got some surroundings that are very noisy, especially if I've got one of my subjects where I've underexposed the image a lot and brought the shadows up a lot. Then it's going to be pretty noisy. It won't be so evident though on the subject. What I might want to do, and I certainly don't want to be sharpening a noisy area, so what I might want to do is to do local sharpening. So if we zoom in a bit and have a look, and again I have to go to 8 bits in order to be able to use this. There is a sharpening tool here, and you can choose how strong you want it to be, and if I press the right button and make it the size that I want, I can now go over what I want sharpened and paint the sharpness onto it and be quite subtle about it in terms of what I'm sharpening and what I'm not sharpening. And this in fact can allow you to use stronger sharpening than would be the case if you're otherwise would be causing problems by sharpening areas that are noisy, for example. So there's local sharpening in Elements. So we've looked at a lot of examples, and summarizing, I think that Elements is a good tool. I think it's powerful. It's not as easy to use as some other applications like Helicon Filter or Photo Ninja. Probably. I'm not familiar with Photo Ninja, but I understand it is particularly easy to use. On the other hand, it's not as difficult as some products. It's not as difficult as Photoshop. It's not as difficult, in my view, as Silky Pix. So it's somewhere in the middle in terms of usability, and it's also, well, I was going to say somewhere in the middle as far as power goes. It's pretty powerful if you're prepared to learn how to drive it. I've certainly found with these examples that, with the exception possibly of recovering colours in bleached areas, it's pretty much done what I wanted it to. And assuming that once I'd found out where to go on the menus, it actually made it fairly easy to do things, and I feel very comfortable using it. I have to say that I have used Elements before some years ago for a little while, and I have used Photoshop CS2 as well, again some years ago, so the menus are not entirely mysterious to me, although some things are in different places from where they used to be, and some things like layers I've never really used anyway. So I find Elements with ACR to my taste in terms of dealing with raw images, and for the price I got it for, I thought that Elements was about 70 UK pounds, which is what I thought I paid for it when I bought version 11. But I've just bought version 14 for £40, and I have to say I think that's a bargain at that price. And that was new. I mean, that was from Amazon. That was its legitimate copy. So there we are. That's Elements and ACR. A bit of a long video. Sorry about that. But we've looked at lots of examples, and that's all for now. Goodbye.